Okay, the next segment will be on heart anatomy. So we're going to focus on the model and the chart and less on me as the instructor. So I'm going to try to tell you some important things about the heart itself and how it's doing its job of pumping the blood. This particular model is a little bit larger than life size. I always love the textbook tells you that just about every organ we think of, the kidneys, the heart, and so on, are about the size of your fist. So of course that's relative to your own personal size, but if you imagine this just being a little bit smaller, the heart itself is housed between the lungs, and it's housed in the thoracic cavity, and more specifically the pericardial cavity. We think of cardial whenever we think of the heart. Pericardial meaning around the heart. So pericardial cavity, there's actually a double layered membrane surrounding the heart called the pericardial membrane. It's got two layers, the parietal and visceral layer. You don't need to know those two, but there's actually fluid between those, and that fluid is very important at cushioning and protecting the heart. And if you've ever heard of pericarditis or inflammation of those membranes, it can be very painful and very problematic because your heart is so critical for your organ function. So if we imagine that we could take a cross section of the heart, and I think what I'll do is use the chart for this first section. If we imagine that we're able to take and cut a heart directly down the middle and take a look at the internal components, we'd see that it's essentially, it's kind of at an angle, and it's essentially got four chambers. We talk about the apex, the pointed end, pointing down and to the left side of the body. So the apex or the point of the heart pointing towards the left side. And the two upper chambers are called atria. So we talk about the right atrium and the left atrium. Now you don't see in this diagram the left atrium very clearly, but if you take your textbook and look at page 96, there's this same cross section of the heart. So the atria are what we call receiving chambers. And beneath them, the blood's always flowing sort of downwards in the heart itself in these two major chambers, from the atrium to the ventricles. So again, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So those four chambers are very important to kind of landmark where you're at in the heart itself. And when we look at them, one of the things that we notice is very thick myocardium, the very thick muscle layer. And I always notice that the left ventricle has the thickest myocardium. So that always helps me if I'm stuck on left and right. The thickest myocardium is around the left ventricle. And that's because the left side of the heart is going to be the pump for that systemic circuit that we mentioned earlier, pumping the blood to the entire body and back to the heart. In a minute we'll get to the flow of blood. But for now, right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. The other component that's important to this are the valves. I'm sure you've heard of heart valves. The valves that separate these chambers. So between the right atrium and the right ventricle is what we call the right atrioventricular valve, or right AV valve. You've probably heard it more commonly called the tricuspid. Tricuspid because it has three little flaps of tissue that will separate the atrium from the ventricle. I prefer to call them AV valves because I think that's more meaningful, atrioventricular, to separate those. So right AV valve and the left AV valve isn't really visible here, but the left AV valve would separate the left atrium and the left ventricle. It's more commonly called the bicuspid valve. And bicuspid you can picture as a mitral shape, again sometimes called the mitral valve. It looks sort of like a bishop's hat, if that helps you think of that shape. So two flaps of tissue, bicuspid, and in more of a kind of pointed mitral shape. The other valves are from the ventricles to the blood vessels that they serve. So when we think of, for example, the left ventricle, that one that has the really thick myocardium, the blood will travel from the left ventricle to the aorta. The aorta is the largest artery in the body. We always have arteries going away from the heart. And the blood, or the valve I should say, between those, and it's not labeled on this diagram, but the valve that's between those is called the aortic valve, and they're sometimes called semilunar. I believe in your textbook they actually just call them semilunar valves because they look like half-moon shapes, and so in your text it's just called semilunar. I prefer to call it the aortic semilunar because it's serving the aorta. From the right ventricle the blood is flowing into a vessel that's going to carry the blood to the lungs. It's called the pulmonary trunk because it's going to serve the lungs. And so this one's going to be called the pulmonary semilunar valve. Again, it's not labeled in your text as pulmonary, but it's just called semilunar, and they're just labeled together. But aortic semilunar from the left ventricle to the aorta, pulmonary semilunar from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk. Now, you might notice in your textbook and on this chart that these blood vessels have different colors. And I didn't want to confuse you in the earlier segment. I want to make sure that you recognize the reason those colors are there is related to carrying oxygen. The blood that has a lot of oxygen is going to appear more red because the oxygen binds to hemoglobin, gives it a phenotypic change, and it looks more red to our eyes. When blood is low in oxygen, it looks more blue or purple. And so you might notice that even though these are both arteries, that the aortic blood is red, and that makes sense. You want to deliver oxygen-rich blood to the entire body. The pulmonary trunk or pulmonary aorta is blue in color, even though it's also an artery, and that's because the blood is low in oxygen and in fact needs to be replenished in the lung tissue. So now that we have those landmarks as well, the 4 chambers and the 4 valves, let's take a look at a couple of other things. This kind of main separation between the 2 really large ventricles is called the septum or interventricular septum. Let's see what else I wanted to point out. The little muscles that anchor the valves are called papillary muscles. Those little sort of string-like structures that will connect the valves to the papillary muscles are called chordae tendineae, literally heartstrings, chordae tendineae. So they're really tiny, tiny, tiny little tendons. I always say, next time you write your Valentine, you can say something about the chordae tendineae, but no students have ever really taken me up on that, at least that I know of. So when you notice those in the book, the muscles that are really on the ventricle walls are papillary muscles. They look like little projections, and then the string-like structures are chordae tendineae. And they just prevent the valves from sort of blowing out, if you want to think of it that way. So let's try to kind of walk through the pathway of blood and think about how the blood is going to be moving in those pulmonary and systemic circuits, and then we can use the model to do the same thing. The blood is going to be entering let's start with the right atrium. The blood is going to be entering those in 2 really large blood vessels that you've probably heard of. The superior vena cava, it's a vein, it's returning blood to the heart, and you could actually draw an arrow in your textbook to show that blood would be returning from everywhere above the heart, essentially, the arms, the head. The blood's returning in the superior vena cava. From below, and it's sort of behind the image, and I'll be able to show you on the model more clearly, the inferior vena cava. So maybe now would be a good time for me to show you the model if we pop off the front of it here. This would be the right atrium. Blood from the superior vena cava would be entering. In fact, I can pop that off too. So blood would be entering the right atrium from the superior vena cava and also from the inferior vena cava. So blood would be sort of flowing up from below the heart itself. I can't fit that through there, but you get the idea. So from the right atrium, the blood doesn't need to go very far. It only needs to go to the right ventricle. So the right atrium pushes, and we'll see that there's a pattern where the atria contract simultaneously and then the ventricles contract simultaneously. But for now, right atrium pushes the blood through the tricuspid valve. You might be able to see the little flaps of tissue here. There are 3 flaps. That's why it's called tricuspid or right AV valve into that right ventricle. From here, the blood's going to flow into the pulmonary semilunar valve. That will shut, allowing the blood to be in the pulmonary trunk. You notice the blue color. The pulmonary trunk is an artery. It's going to be splitting into the left and right pulmonary arteries that serve the left and right lung respectively. You notice that the blood is purple or bluish in color. I know the model's kind of gray, but more blue in color, low in oxygen. In the lungs, you'll get that change. In the pulmonary capillaries, you'll get the oxygen delivered into the blood, and CO2 will be released, and the blood will return in what we call pulmonary veins. You might notice that the pulmonary veins are actually red. When we think of systemic veins, we think of blue, and so most people, that's kind of a surprise. Pulmonary veins are going to be red in color. They return the blood, the pulmonary veins return the blood to the left atrium. Can't really pop that open, but from behind you can see that those are going to be flowing into that left atrium. As in the case of the right atrium, we just have to send the blood down to the ventricle, so through the bicuspid or left AV valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle has to do the most work. It's going to be pumping the blood into the aorta to go out to the body. So it's going to go through the aortic semilunar valve. I think if I tilt this a little, you can see the aortic semilunar valve. And from the aorta then, lots of branching. There are thousands of blood vessels. Remember, arteries, arterioles, and then the systemic capillaries would do the reverse of what the lungs did. The systemic capillaries would deliver oxygen to cells, pick up CO2 and waste products, and again, to complete the cycle from the systemic capillaries to venules and veins like superior and inferior vena cava back to the heart itself. So it takes some time, get familiar. You have to learn the parts first before you do the pathway. There are hundreds of animations online, and I have a few posted that really walk you through and I think very nicely show you the pathway of blood. As you move into the latter part of the chapter, you'll find that the atria are going to contract simultaneously, so squeeze together, forcing the blood to the ventricles, and then the ventricles squeeze simultaneously and force the blood into their respective blood vessels. And that heartbeat sound, that lub-dub sound that you're probably familiar with, is actually those valves closing. The AV valves close first, and then the semilunar valves close simultaneously, and you get that lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub sound of heartbeat. So that's the pathway of blood through the heart.